Welcome to Props and Hops, a podcast pursuing the best in betting and beer. I'm your host, Matt Landis, and if you're listening to this show, then I'd say odds are fairly high that your podcast feed is highly populated this week with Masters content, NFL draft shows. So we're going to do something a little bit different, calling an audible and talking the other football, a soccer soiree, if you will, with Timothy Lawson, the host of the Better Life podcast. Tim, welcome back to Props and Hops.
Thank you so much, Matt. It is so good to be here. I absolutely love betting on soccer, and I don't get to talk about it enough. So I was so glad that you thought to have me back on. Thank you.
I don't know if this audience gets to hear about it enough because I certainly wouldn't say that I think about it enough to uncover some betting edges. We will do what we can to that end. But first things first, Tim, since your last appearance on this show last February, you and your wife have welcomed your first child into the world. So I think putting our priorities in line here, congratulations to that. And I'd say let's weave in the hops first and foremost here because that warrants a hearty toast. I've got to say, Tim, cheers. And what are you drinking to kick off this conversation?
So this is Three Notched Brewing Company. It's called Emperor of the Clouds. It's an Imperial IPA. It's out of Charlottesville, Virginia. So it's not really it's hard to call it local because it's like way on the other side of it's like 5 hours away in Virginia. But I like supporting Virginia whenever I can. Oh yeah,
there we go.
That's the sound right there. Everybody tunes into Props and Hops with that sound right there.
Love it. Well, cheers to you. I just took my first sip of a beer, also from a local brewery, but not so much local inspired. I figured if we're talking soccer, maybe go with a European inspired beer. So this is by a powerhouse brewery that people have heard on the show if they've listened over the past few years, Monkish Brewing Company. But it's not one of the IPAs that they're known for. This one is called Images of Rapture. It's a German-style dark lager, 5.1% ABV. I figured German soccer, maybe notwithstanding this most recent World Cup, I like to think they're among the elites, and this beer could be fitting for the theme of the conversation. So yeah, we talk about the hops a lot on this show. I can tell you one sip in, this is quite the malty beer, but that's probably what you'd expect with a German-style dark lager. So happy to have that as a companion to this conversation. And Tim, before we dig into anything that's going to be fun from a betting perspective, but not as important in real life, how's fatherhood treating you?
Oh man, fatherhood is as I'm a new dad. This is our first, and you never know, you don't know what to expect because people are both like encouraging them, like, oh, fatherhood's great. It's being a dad's the best thing that's ever happened to me. And then you have, but at the same time, people are like, just wait, life sucks. You can't you can't do fun things anymore. So you don't know what to expect. Like, so is it fun or is it not? Someone tell, and lo and behold, it's a mix of the both. But I mean, my wife and I are just blessed to have just the most beautiful, joyful daughter. She just beams with light every day. Like every morning when I wake her up, she's just excited to see me. And, and like my wife's not even that excited. Like my dog is the only person who rivals my daughter in how excited they are to see me on any given day, which is why they're my favorite critters in the world. But yeah, it's a bit fatherhood. We're 5 months in, so far, so good.
Love it. Yeah, a couple of my best friends are between a year and a half. So it seems like a time that, from my understanding, not having any children myself at this point, but I gather that it can be pretty grueling and at the same time, maybe one of the most rewarding experiences that you'll get. So glad to hear that all is well in the Better family through about 5 months. And to that end, Tim, also, since your last appearance on this show, I've got to think we're just always growing on this journey as bettors. And I'd be remiss not to ask how you have evolved as a bettor since your last Props and Hops appearance.
Yeah, so gambling overall, anybody who listens to the Better Life know that I take betting on soccer and sports seriously, but I'm also a recreational casino player. And gambling overall obviously has taken a backseat to the kid, right? But sports betting, because it's legal in in the state of Virginia, and we have like 10 or 12 outs that are available on my phone. I can fit sports betting into my life without neglecting any other part of my life, right? I can do it on the John if I need to, right? It's so that part of me, I think one of the biggest concerns that anybody has when we're becoming a new parent is that pieces of them are going to go away, right? Like the parts of who makes up what makes me Tim Lawson felt threatened by having a kid, right? Because just time and space and energy, everything's different. You focus on the kid. and you worry like, oh man, what parts of me am I going to have to sacrifice and give away? I still have my motorcycle. I'm not quite sure how. I don't know how long I'll have that thing still, right? But like, I know sooner or later that's going to have to go, right? But thankfully, this hobby of sports betting that I've enjoyed for the greater part of, the better part of my life, definitely my almost my entire adulthood, I can still enjoy it because of the accessibility that it has now with the legalization and in other ways. So, it in that way, that's, it's both change, like it's the same and also different. But I've also, like, sports betting specific, I've put more focus on markets that I'm confident in. I think like a lot of people, when you're a recreational sports bettor, you're just sort of like a year-round player, right? Whatever sport's going on, that's the sport you're into. You're tailing someone, or you're doing your own stuff. I tail less, but I'm more selective on what I tail. And a lot of times when I use it when I'm tailing other people's, it's just because I want to diverse stuff in the account, so the account stays live, stuff like that. But I'm much more focused on the markets and the leagues that I am confident in, and not trying to just always have action on any given night or week in whatever sport's going on. Like golf. I don't really bet golf. I'll have some action on the Masters because that's an annual tradition for me. Otherwise, I just sort of let go of golf, which a couple of years ago, every tournament I would try to have, like some sort of ticket just to sort of have that sweat. It just ain't bothering me anymore that I don't have anything. College basketball, I had a handful of bets through March Madness. I didn't force anything, moving forward when it got to like Sweet 16, Elite 8, stuff like that. And that's like, I wouldn't have been as comfortable is not the right word for it, but like it would have been difficult for me to just not want to have action in some way every night of March Madness for the sake of the entertainment value, right? And so, I guess I'm talking more of a multi-year evolution there, but specifically in the last year, you're talking about just weeding out the stuff that I don't need to be betting, even if it was stuff that I was like confident in and comfortable with betting. I'm just, my bankroll, my time, everything is more demanding, and so I'm just hyper focused on the stuff that I'm good at.
One of the biggest advantages that I've talked about over the course of doing the show that I think ties in really well with that answer is that the biggest edge we have as bettors is the option to pick our spots. Books, especially on a big college basketball Saturday or for a lot of bigger events, they've got to list lines for so many different types of bets.
Yeah.
And we get to pick our spots, which is really crucial because if we're laying the VIG, then we should be confident in the markets in which we're picking our spots. I mean, I think back to last night as we record this conversation, the evening of Tuesday, April 4th. Last night, the college basketball championship game was about to tip off. And while I didn't go to San Diego State, I'm from San Diego. So my wife asked if I had anything riding on the game, just as an entertainment type of bet.
Yeah.
And I didn't, because I felt like I had enough emotionally invested in the game. And with this being the title game, it's not like if you're shopping for point spreads or totals or money lines, like good luck in the title game finding big discrepancies at any sort of scale. And yeah, if I really went down prop menus and hustled, I probably could have found an edge here or there. But just for the sake of putting down money on the game because it was on, I was invested enough in a rooting interest. And I felt grateful not to have bet on the game because, as we all saw, kind of as expected, UConn had its way over the course of that matchup. And there was no need to compound an emotional rooting interest with, some financial stake that I didn't think I had a clear edge in. So I totally get it. If people do want to put money they can afford to lose into an event just because they're going to watch it, if it is a championship game in a major sport or a tournament like the Masters, I totally understand it. But I also think that there's a lot to be said for being selective and sticking to the areas in which you have more confidence. And Tim, I think that leads us really well into soccer because that's, probably your bread and butter. I don't think I'm mixing things up, to put it that way. And you touched on this a little bit the first time I had you on the show, but I could certainly use the refresher. So I guess some listeners could as well. Okay. As we get into soccer, I'd love to kick it off by asking you to describe your overall approach to betting the sport.
Yeah. So, some listeners are probably wondering like, oh, April is when we're going to start talking about soccer. Like, but some of the leagues are starting to wrap up in a couple of months, but American League Soccer is where I really get down, right? MLS, USL, NWSL, right? And those are just starting, which is why soccer is big for me right now. My approach to betting soccer, it starts with sides and totals, and in handicapping, the matchups, the injuries, the red red cards. I have one data provider that has like goals added metrics for each player, right? And so trying to figure out on it, if someone's out for a red card, what impact might that have to, do I think that has to the team and their dynamic and their way to matching up? And it starts with sides and totals, and it goes down. I mean, I can't really get into unfortunately, I really can't get into like the really smaller markets like I used to, like the team totals, the both teams to score. I can still get a little bit down on it, but like I used to try to hit like exact score or correct score markets, and I was doing fairly well on that. Exact score 2-0 here, but like only places that really offer stuff on that are regulated books, and you get limited super quick if those are the kind of markets you're hitting, right? So unfortunately, I can't get on those as much as I used to. But it's I have a mix of quantitative and qualitative analysis, right? I have the quantitative in that I'm looking at expected goals against, expected goal differentials, and looking at goals added for individual players. I look at first half and second half performances to see if there's, do I want to take something in pre-flop, or do I want to wait till the second half, expecting this team to perform better in the second half than maybe they will in the first. It starts there with the quantitative stuff. Then the qualitative stuff is, I watch the matches, and there's you can't, your eyes can be deceiving. It's, you can watch a match, and just like with any other game, with any other sport, football, basketball, whatever it may be, when you sort of you can see what's going on. Even more in soccer, like you can see where teams are losing possession, where they're building up right. Are they sometimes you see soccer in the form of insanity, when they're just like constantly sending the ball up the right and they're never getting an opportunity. Like, well, that's not going to work for them. You start looking at the other side because they're able to hold that off. So, quantitatively, that's where I get a lot of my pre-flop bets. Qualitatively, that's where you start picking up on live bets. And even though these markets that I'm really big in, MLS, NWSL, USL especially, the lines have gotten sharper, unfortunately. I mean, like 3-4 years ago, Matt, I mean, like they would have, you'd see 16-1 underdogs, right, on one side. And it's like, no one should be that big of an underdog against anybody in this league, right? But like, unfortunately, they've gotten sharper. The lines are tighter, but the one thing that they haven't been able to do quite right, in my opinion, is properly price adjustments in game, right? Because they're not the in-game adjuster, the algorithm, whatever. It's not making those reads that you are as a viewer, right? It's just going based off of what the score is, how many. The only adjustment that it's making in game that isn't. It knows when like a lot of sites will know when there's a dangerous attack on one side or the other. And so if you have one team that's making a lot of dangerous attacks, even on a 0-0 game, you'll see a lot of in-game prices start to adjust properly to that. But if you get a game that's like really in the middle third of the pitch, and you can sort of tell who's picking whose pocket and stuff like that, you can get an edge both on side and sometimes on total.
One thing that stands out from your answer, going back a minute or so, would be that you had an edge betting exact scores of games. And I'm curious about this because one of the biggest things that I've learned with a lot of betting markets is that it can behoove one to look for binary outcomes, yes, no, or over, under. Oftentimes, the more options there are within one wager, the more vig the book is hiding in these lines. And sometimes you see a juicy plus number that seems attractive, but in all actuality, it's probably not nearly high enough considering the true odds. So that said, if there is a better out there with access to regulated books, hasn't been limited yet, maybe they're not looking to bet a whole lot. They just want to win and make a small profit over time. So they could get down on something like this. Any thought to, counterpunch my notion of looking toward binary outcomes where there could be edges in things like picking exact scores in certain matches?
Yes. I mean, it really comes down to, understanding expected goals, expected goal differential, what both lineups can possibly produce. you can find opportunities on, you can come up with sort of a goal range a little bit, because like, look, like, soccer doesn't have many goals, right? I mean, like, you're talking about a lot of these matches being 1-1, 2-1. Every once in a while you get a flyer that's like 3-2 or 6-1, right? But that barely ever, like, it's so notable when that happens because it's so rare in soccer. A lot of these matches, they start out 0-0, right? And then you might see when you see a line or a total of 2.5, the market's expecting a goal probably in both halves, and then you have to decide if you think that there's going to be a third goal or not, right? I mean, like that, like that's how simple a 2.5 goal line is. And if you feel like, I guess a good way of, if you can parse out expected goals and the differential, sort of figure out what the range of outcomes you think there might be, and it's going to be a short one, right? And there's not a lot of options there, or there's not a lot of events that are going to happen there. If you, a lot of times, like, I'll like lean to the under, like under 2.75, but it'll be too much juice for me to want to get into. Maybe I'm going to look at it, but I also think that it's going to stay under with a shutout. Well, then now 1-0 and 2-0, those are worth looking at, right? And and look, any bet can lose, right? I'm not saying that any bet can lose, but you start looking at which side of the total do you think this is going? Who do you think? Do you think one team can shut out the other? You start going down the process of elimination of like what score lines do I find to be most probable here? And you'll end up finding, even on like a 2.75, you'll find like a 2-0 number at 9-1 or something like that. It'll just be off a little bit. Like, I feel like, for a game that I lean under, and that's usually the difference, right? To where, like, you think there's VIG built in, but the book's going to be built in on the VIG on the side that the market is leaning already on the goal, on the game total, right? And so, anyways, I feel like I was rambling there. I apologize if I didn't actually get somewhere with that, because I haven't had to say any of that stuff out loud in a while. So as an extrovert, I had to process a bit of it while I was saying it. But the point I was getting to is, if you're confident in your numbers and feel like you have good data, you can find correct score lines with some value if you lean differently than the market does, or you lean further than the market does, and you think that the options of betting, two or three correct scores may be more maybe a better price than just taking one side or the other on the total, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I'll say there's nothing like putting somebody on the spot when they've got an Imperial IPA in hand if you really want to peel back the curtain. So I do appreciate the context there. And
By
I
the way,
also know that you said your bread and butter right now when it comes to the US leagues is primarily in-game, because books are mostly pricing off the chart. Yes, they might account for dangerous attacks, but beyond that, it's a pretty rudimentary process on their end. So if
especially on
somebody is
totals,
interested in that in-game wagering approach, would you say there's any insight you can lend there that might be more scalable than trying to cherry pick soft lines at regulated books pre-flop, so to speak?
Yeah, I mean, my favorite look in game is when you might get a game that's totaled at 3, and I think that's fair, or maybe I think we're gonna see 3 or more goals. You get some of these books where they dropped a 2.5 on their in-game total around like minute 25, and sure, when you think about the amount of time that's left and it's gone, maybe that is the right adjustment. Maybe they're adjusting credit. But if you're watching a game and if you're familiar with the teams and know when, how long it takes for teams to build up, some teams really open up in the second half, stuff like that, right? And if you're more familiar with teams in that sense, then I mean, so I think this goes for most leagues. Maybe not be as true in the top flights in Europe, like Serie A, Premier League, La Liga, Bundesliga. It's a little trickier there, but a lot of the American leagues, a lot of the lower league soccers, like the Segunda Liga, stuff like that, a lot of these in-game totals, I believe, drop too quickly, too early in the match, just because a certain amount of time has gone by when when certain teams, certain actions. I mean, like, you could see 2 goals go by in the 40th and then 45th minute. Like that in. Yeah, so in-game totals, I believe, is, especially if you lean over, is really where the opportunities are.
You also touched on some of the European leagues over the course of that answer, and I'd love to get to some of those because while a lot of US leagues are just underway, European leagues are wrapping up across much of the world, or I guess much of the continent would be a better way to put it. And Tim, how would you compare or contrast betting those European leagues relative to a lot of what you just shared regarding the domestic leagues here in the US?
Lost my mouse here. Sorry, I'm gonna close. I've been sweating this game. That was right here.
Oh, cool. Which one's going on right now?
It's the U.S. Open Cup. It was Knoxville and Memphis. The Open Cup is kind of like the American League tournament, so their interleague. Like, how like Champions League goes on during the European schedule. The U.S. Open Cup goes on during the American schedule. And I had the underdog, and they just conceded a goal, so I don't want to watch it anymore. I'm not going to make myself sweat that while I'm doing this. So, European, something that I think, one, I mean, European League, especially the top flight stuff, it's sharper, right? I mean, it's just, the Premier League is arguably sharper than the NFL globally, right? If you think about a global markets, and if anybody's scoffing at that idea, I've heard professional bettors that more than I'm making in a year have commented on the same thing. So you're dealing with sharper lines, but you can get down more quickly, and you can get the access to lines more quickly, which is huge, right? The faster you can get to a line, the better. The more time you have to either get on early line. A great, MLS is sort of the exception here. You can usually get MLS lines pretty quickly in the week, but I mean, after a Saturday day of European soccer, if you see something that you think, matters to the next match or whatever, and whether, red card, this guy got suspended. Okay, I'm going to look up, his goals added is nearly a half a goal, right? So this guy matters to the back line. The back line's already poor. Probably going to be an overmatch, like you can oftentimes bet on that relatively quickly once the day's games are over. Some books will repost the next week's lines. Sometimes it'll be built in, sometimes it won't. You can get ahead of that movement sometimes. Whereas, with American soccer, stuff. I mean, the USL just opened today. USL is opening a lot earlier than they ever have. Today's Tuesday. I used to have to wait till Friday mornings for Saturday matches in the USL. So it's unreal that on a Tuesday we're getting these. But the books get a couple of days to sort of have their to process this information, and it's not, they don't always get it right, but they do have that little bit of delay. And they can often make that adjustment more easily. European soccer, one thing I think that gets overlooked, and I'm not like, everybody has their process. I like to bet. I like betting as many leagues as I can. Especially, I'm betting all of these European leagues when American soccer is not going on. But I think one thing that gets overlooked is, like, these different leagues have sort of their own culture for how the game is typically played, right? And the clubs influence that culture. And this is really difficult, I think, to explain on a podcast, but I'm hopefully going to make sense here. Like, when it comes to, the style of play, each club's different, but I have certain markets that I like to play in certain leagues because the books are pricing these markets similarly across all leagues, but when you look at the data per league and per club, when you go top down all the way to like player level, right, it should be a little bit different per league, just with the way that either the reputation of that league, like Bundesliga is known to be a high scoring league, right? They have a handful of of teams that just like to light up of course they have a range of successful teams and not successful teams, but you're often going to find higher totals there. So you're very rarely going to want look for betting a total is difficult because you either have to be willing to find those spots where the under is going to come in, right, or you have to be willing to so that's not really a league that where I'd be looking at those markets. Whereas in the in Segunda Liga, right, the second league in Spain, right, it's a low scoring culture, right? Like there aren't a lot of goals scored, but sometimes you will find these matches that are just they're priced with the reputation of the club and not how the data is showing how these clubs should be priced. And so you could find really low totals in Segunda Liga that you can find a good over opportunity. Places in Bundesliga, it's like, oh, these two teams are high scoring. It's like, well, actually, if you look at the way their midfield's going to match up, or this back line's a lot better than they're getting credit for. I don't know if I'm explaining this well enough, but like the markets are being priced almost the same way across the sport. And while there are some league specific things that I think are different from league to league based on the culture of the league itself and the clubs within it.
Yeah, I think generally speaking, I'm following with what you're saying, and I would like to drill in specifically on some angles for European leagues
people have stopped
the rest
listening.
of the season. So Bundesliga, if we're saying that the books often treat soccer just as one entity across the European leagues, and Bundesliga is higher scoring, Segunda Liga is lower scoring, is it fair to say that angles you might eye for the rest of the season, what's left of it across a lot of these European leagues, would be that Bundesliga, maybe there could be some value looking toward overs, Segunda Liga, maybe some value looking toward unders, or if we drill in on angles that it would behoove the audience to consider for European leagues, maybe I flipped it there. How would you describe an approach to try to really drill in on a few things without having to feel like you need to develop an understanding so quickly of all the different leagues across the continent?
Yeah. The one thing that's nice is, if you have a site, if you have data that you trust, so long as the data is being measured the same way, you should have a equitable understanding of each club, right? And that is our advantage as handicappers. And look, I'm not saying that some of that is baked into the line, but you will also see reputation of clubs sort of tilt over. A great example is just a few days ago, PSG. This is in Ligue 1 in France. PSG taking on Lyon. It was like the total was 3.5, and they were missing Mbappe. Neymar was out, and Lionel Messi and oh goodness, why can't I think of his name? The young star in France. This is what happens when you have a kid.
Man. I'm the wrong guy.
All of a sudden, you just cannot remember the most obvious things because your brain's fried from a number of things. Mbappe. There we go. Mbappe. You have these, so they've, the reputation of PSG is a bunch of goals, but it's like, Lyon's, midfield and back line are going to be able to absorb this. Or, I think that, PSG is going to have their opportunities with possession and stuff like that. And if you looked into, the metrics, the expected goals for PSG is high, but like that's also because every goal they shoot against the middle of the table down is being measured that way. If you look at just in sort of their XG when they're playing teams with tougher back lines and defensive midfielders, it is a little bit lower. And so here's this line being posted because of this high profile matchup, and teams that are considered strong offensively, not really taking into account how the data looks when these two play each other, with more pure data than just how this team has done throughout the year. Yeah, PSG has a high XG throughout the year, but that's because they have like 4 superstars on their team, 5 superstars. When they're playing middle of the table on down, yeah, they're gonna perform well. But when they're playing against them, Marseilles and Monacos and Lyons and the Lilles of the world, like that XG goes down a little bit because they're playing tougher opponents. And that 3.5 that I ended up getting at the high points was just unwarranted. And sure enough, the game ended up 1-0 in Lyon's favor. Like PSG didn't even get a goal. And so Footy Stats is the site that I use. Footystats.org is one of the sites I use most often for European soccer stuff. American Soccer Analysis is the site that I use most often for American soccer stuff. Really good goals added metrics over at American Soccer Analysis. But if someone's like, yeah, I want to make a bet here and I want my bet to be a little bit more informed, starting with this site that's providing XG, XGA, XG differential. XG differential is essentially, how many goals were you expected to score, and how many did you actually score? Is that a plus or a minus? If it's a plus, you've been a little more fortunate than usual. If it's a minus, you've been a little more unlucky. Like reading that stuff, and it's crazy, Matt. Have you ever found a metric in any sport? And I'm sure, and this isn't I'm asking for what your example is here because we've all done it. You find a metric and it unlocks some understanding that you now have about the sport. Has that ever happened to you?
I'm sure there are so many examples, and Las Vegas Chris might ridicule me if he hears my answer to this question, because I know that, I'll go to the NFL, and if we can say with a high degree of confidence that a team is due for turnover regression, that doesn't mean it's going to happen in any given game or perhaps even in any given season. And a big enough sample size, yes, but we don't know when it's going to happen. And LVC has been championing that while turnover regression may be real, timing it is another endeavor altogether. Yeah. That said, I think it was the 2020 NFL season, the Dallas Cowboys. Early on in that season, every time I had a bet involving them, it seemed like every time I would watch a snap that offense takes, they're losing fumbles left and right. And it just got silly at a certain point. And so I knew, based on their point differential, based on their one-loss record, they're a pretty good team masquerading as a terrible team. And you don't know when that's going to turn around, but just understanding that, okay, just because some metrics might say this, their one-loss record says that, it's not a true indication of what that team is going to be over the long haul. Now, the NFL is an inherently small sample size sport, so it doesn't mean that suddenly, for the last 3 weeks, the Cowboys have lost a lot of fumbles, time to just start betting them blind. That's probably not a surefire recipe for success, but that's what I think of to kind of answer your question is, yeah, it sucks to bet a team and lose in a way that just seemingly the most fluky stuff bounces against you. But to try to divorce yourself from what you're seeing in the moment and think about the bigger picture, not guaranteeing the bigger picture is going to play out on any specific time horizon, it can still give you at least a better directional sense of true talent and strength of a team or a player.
Yeah. When I think if no one's ever looked at expected goal metrics, right? And you have to look at XGA just as much, right? How many expected goals against, right? Because you have to see, how much, how many. And I always say expected goals because as if everybody knows exactly what I'm talking about, right? But expected goals is essentially throughout the course of play, how many goals was the team expected to have scored, right? And that seems really simple. A penalty kick, I believe, I'm always off by a couple points. I believe it's like 0.78, right? Because a penalty kick's not guaranteed. You can have goal, you can always miss. A good goalkeeper can save. So like a penalty kick is about 0.78. If you were standing right in front of the goal and no one was in front of you, and you were 6 yards away, that would be one expected goal, right? Like you would be expected to score that. If you were way off in the corner and you happen to bend it like Beckham and get an Olympico and get it to curl in over 3, like that's probably like 0.1 expected goals on that, right? Maybe even less, 0.05 or something like that. And so, you can see these XG Philosophy is a Twitter handle that measures a lot of European soccer XG. they're a really great follow if you're into soccer, because after a match they'll tweet out what the expected goals are, and it tells the story, right? It essentially tells a bit of the story of this team scored 3, their expected goals was 0.78, right? And the team they played 1.2 expected goals, but they didn't score any, right? And so you see the variance immediately in one stat line. And so you can look at, it almost revolutionizes the way you think about the game when you first take in good XG data, because you can look at two teams, and I'm not talking about I'm not talking about the Real Madrids and Barcelonas, whatever, but I'm talking like the good teams, right, that are towards the top of the table, and then the bad teams, right, that are towards the bottom of the table. You can get a matchup when you look at those XG and you're like, wow, these teams are a lot more similar than I would have given them credit for, because of where they are on the table, because of the success they've had in certain games. And you can look at that, and the line won't always reflect that closer to pick 'em as they are, and you can often find a lot of value there.
I'll cross sports again with a comparison, but that last point reminds me of, I think it was the 2007 NBA playoffs, dating myself a bit. But if I recall correctly, it was 07. I believe the Mavs were a 1 seed in the Western Conference and the Warriors were an 8 seed. I think it was the Baron Davis Warriors team. And this might have been more matchup dependent than advanced metric dependent, like the last point you made. But sometimes just because one team is seemingly bulletproof and another team might not even seem like it belongs on the same field or court or whatever the playing surface may be, there are factors in play that just looking at the seeding, it doesn't tell you nearly as much as you'd think. And I found that playoff series so fascinating between the Warriors and Mavs, because in the NBA, almost every time, unlike one football game or the flukiness we can see in a soccer match or the NHL playoffs or the baseball playoffs, and the NBA over the course of a series, the better team almost always is its will and comes out on top. And in that case, there was just, again, maybe it was some metrics, also probably heavily matchup driven, but a scenario of, a bottom dwelling team versus a top dwelling team. And it's a lot closer than you might think, if not even lopsided in favor of the seemingly inferior team.
Something that I think a lot of new or even still wet behind the ears soccer bettors discount is managers, because anybody who watches soccer, you're like, the coach isn't doing anything, he's just sitting on the sideline just yelling at people, right? He's not calling plays or whatever, and you think but managers, they game plan, they come up with the tactics, they're choosing subs, which is more significant than I think the average bettor might give credit for. And and I don't expect anybody to know who these teams are, but in the USL, Ben Pierman, who was the coach of Memphis 901 last year, that team's offense was a powerhouse all through the season. He moves to Charleston. Memphis is now at the bottom of the table, struggling they have the same players, Matt, that were creating goals last year, all of a sudden are struggling to create goals. Why? Because it's a different tactics. It's a different, formation. People who are less familiar with soccer may not realize, but the midfield and the defense, they all sort of make lines, and then they have an offensive shape. Like all that, when you really start watching a lot of soccer, you see all this put into play and how and it becomes really interesting when you think about the tactics of it. And managers influence that, and they dictate that, not only what those shapes look like, but how the players are involved, stuff like that. And this is a great example of really good coach employed his system with good players, and now a mediocre coach with a mediocre system is not getting the same productivity out of those players because it's not as an effective system. Whereas now in Charleston, where Ben Pierman is now coaching, they've gone from the bottom of the table from last year, and they're one of the most exciting offenses to watch. Their XG is great every week, and that's the impact that a coach, a manager has, both, in being removed and then being added, and understanding, sort of like in the NFL, like we know which coaches make good decisions, right? Like that's something that it gets, Monday morning, Matt, the thing we hear about the most is what coaches made good decisions. Like, oh, there was 3 minutes left and I can't believe he called that timeout, whatever. the same thing happens in soccer. You see the substitutions that are being made. You're seeing the formations that are being called. You're seeing the starting lineups, at the beginning of the game, stuff like that, and it's all just as impactful.
When it comes to bringing this all together on the world's biggest stage, I know this year we've also got a Women's World Cup coming up in July, and got to talk to you about that while I have you talking soccer here. And with that tournament being a few months out, first and foremost, Tim, how do you look at a futures market for a tournament like the World Cup?
So international soccer, I think, is it's challenging, man. I think, look, I know people that are successful at it. A couple of my betting partners who take a lot of my American soccer plays and action, they were hitting me up like, hey, like I want some action today. Who do I got? I'll admit I'm not great at international soccer because you're talking about players that all play on different clubs in different leagues in different time zones, and now they're all playing on the same team together. And you can get lucky with France and England and stuff like that, where these players may share the pitch together, at the club level. But that's not always the case, and it's difficult to know how these teams are going to meld, how good's the manager really. Anyways, all that stuff is difficult. Women's soccer is slightly different because the game is not as developed as the men's side. And so what ends up
clarify that point, but with the game not being as developed?
So a lot of these countries do not, a lot of these national teams do not have the same kind of support that, like America and Canada and them have, right? Like, it's for a lot of these teams, like Vietnam, like it's a huge deal that their team has the organization and the funding and the players to play and then play at this global stage, right? Like, I remember in the 2019, I can't remember which it was an Asian country, and I feel really bad that I can't remember. But like they only scored, I think, 1 goal through the whole tournament, and they celebrated it because it was a huge deal that they were able to get to that stage and accomplish that, right? And to them that mattered. And so because the women's game is still developing as far as where players are playing, right? Like the U.S. national team, I want to say they just had an April roster of 26 players come out. I want to say all but 1 or 2 play for the NWSL in America, right? Whereas if you were to look at the the men's national team, you have some MLS, you have some of them playing in Premier League, you have some playing in France, some are playing in Germany, right? But you have these, but on the women's side, most of them are playing in the NWSL. 1 or 2 are playing in Europe, and that's it, right? And that's and the difference is there's more familiarity with these players. They're seeing each other more often, both competitively and playing on the same team. And that's an advantage that I think, and it's an advantage for the better because the teams the teams are more familiar with each other. There's more, you can be more confident in believing who you think these teams are. The futures market, of course, reflects who's good and who's not. Look, it's U.S. and England are rightfully co-favorites in this in this tournament. Spain and Germany right behind them, understandably. With the way that it's being set up, it's 8 groups of 4 teams, right? And when you go into the elimination stage, Group A plays Group C, Group B plays Group D, and so on. Right, so it's sort of like it's not A, it's A, C, B, D, then all the way down like that. And with the way that's going to work out is with the way that it's split in the quadrants. Spain and England are going to end up on one side of the quad, or on one half, I should say, on one half of the bracket. U.S. and Germany are going to end up on the other half. I really want to take like Norway at 35-1 because they have a lot of quality players. I think they can get out of their group and make it to the quarterfinals. But when they get to the quarterfinals, they have to play Spain or England. And that's, they have to run a gauntlet of England, Spain, presumably, right? And then the final with, whoever's there. But you go on the other side to US and Germany, where I believe Germany is going to end up in the elimination stage. They should make their way to the semifinals with no problem, where they'll play the United States of America, and they will match up pretty well against the U.S. I am a U.S. homer. I have a +3. I have a 3.5 to 1 on the U.S. Not only because I'm homer, but I believe there's a chance that this team might even be as good, if not a tick more exciting than what we saw in 2019. And I'm all in on the United States of America, but you can get Germany at 7 or 8 to 1 right now, and they are probably going to. They'll have to compete. They'll have to play. It's not going to be, they're not going to roll over a lot of, all the teams. But I think they're safely going to get to that semifinal round, and I would like to have an 8 to 1 ticket at that point. And so, when people are asking me who I like outside of the United States, I think Germany has the best chance to take a decent price for farther into the tournament.
And when I think about a futures market, I can't help myself but to think about the option to do a moneyline rollover, a mechanical rollover, whatever you want to call it, where you can shop around for the best money line between matches. You have that element of a ripcord if there's an injury or a matchup that you just don't like and you want to take the money and run. So I feel like what you described about Norway, 35 to 1, intriguing you, but a really tough path. Would you give any thought to perhaps going the moneyline rollover route? And then if they hit a quarterfinal or semifinal matchup that just doesn't suit them well, you're not getting a 35 to 1 payout. But if you walk away at that moment, you're not walking away with zero. How do you look at moneyline rollover opportunities versus just the pure futures odds that are posted right now?
Yeah, it's a good question. In soccer tournaments like this, it's a little difficult because you first have the group stage of the round robin of 3 games, and then you move on to the elimination stage. And teams don't necessarily need to win all of their games in a group stage, right? So the money line rollover kind of either starts at a must-win situation in the group stage, or it starts in the starts in the elimination round. But I would say that if what you could do is like Norway to advance, right? You could do that as sort of the first part of what you're talking about of if that rollover, which I think would be fine because if at that point Norway takes faces Spain in that next round in the quarterfinals, and I'm like, man, Spain looks like Spain arguably has the best player in the world with Alexi at midfielder. I would just not want to sweat my maybe okay, Norway, we've had our fun, good luck, and thanks for the advanced money and whatever we got in the round of 16. But yeah, I think moneyline rollover is fine, especially like you said, if going up against one of these, one of the big teams of, US, England, Spain, Germany, Australia is kind of in there, but Australia is really powerful because they have probably the most dangerous striker in the world with Sam Kerr. But I'm not even, like if Sam Kerr can get Australia to the final, that'd be amazing. But the futures market that I think has a ton of value in Women's World Cup is the golden ball market. Not to be confused with the golden boot market, which is the top goal scorer, like who gets the most goals and assists, or who the top goal scorer is. But the golden ball market's very much like an MVP. And in 2019, I got Megan Rapinoe at 22 to 1, and it was no question. Like going into the final, I was like, if the U.S. wins this, Megan Rapinoe is going to win the golden ball, and sure enough, she did. There's going to be a handful of opportunities. Sam Kerr is probably going to be a good example of the striker for Australia, where you may get a better price on their narrative star player, their narrative motivated player, to be a better price than the team to win the whole thing. Right. Same thing. We saw this with them with NFL with Super Bowl MVPs. Same idea, right? Is there a Super Bowl MVP that's better on, like what Patrick Mahomes, right, was like a couple dollars better on the MVP market than Casey was to win the game or something like that? And a lot of people were saying, well, maybe Patrick Mahomes is the better. Same idea. There's gonna be a few teams. Australia is a really good example where I think you can get you'll be able to get a player at golden ball price better than for them to win it all, and probably just as likely to win.
Well, sticking with the cross-sport comparison you just made, I would love to also get your insight a bit on things beyond the pitch. Consider this a bit of a grab bag question. Major League Baseball is underway. NFL draft is upcoming. NBA and NHL playoffs are around the corner. We've got the Masters as well as other golf and tennis majors that'll be taking place before too long. any other sports that I haven't already named. I know that you focus primarily on soccer, but is there anything else kind of on your radar as a bettor that you're focusing on right now beyond soccer?
Yeah, and I appreciate how you find like, you know what, I think my audience has had enough with the soccer. Let's get to like, people give me a hard time like, I'm not gonna say I have friends that like will talk soccer on their podcast. Like, they'll have they'll be like, dude, as soon as so and so starts talking soccer, like, I just like clock out. I don't even know how to pay attention. It really is the sport that is either you're into it or you're not. Whereas everything else that you just mentioned, I feel like the average bettor can be more familiar, more into it. Soccer just seems to be like this outlier sport of like, either you're really into it or you're not. Look, I will have some sort of action on the Masters. I'll admit the Masters snuck up on me. When I woke up Monday morning, I realized it was the week of the Masters. I was like, oh snap, I'm way behind. So I will be listening to a couple podcasts to find something that I want to play there. It's an annual tradition, Matt, for me to be working at my day job and have the master stream on one screen while I do everything else on the other stream, and just enjoying Jim Nantz talking to me and other things. Like, I just love it, right? Baseball, yes, first inning. That's a big market for me. I have an out that misprices it. I should say misprice. They're usually 5 or 10 cents better than I can find in market, and so I usually, I like betting those.
And to clarify, that's a yes to a run being scored in the first inning to kind of counter the hype that is just seemingly insurmountable these days about the no run first inning crowd.
That's right. Yes. Yeah. I'll play a couple games a day probably on the yes first inning market. I don't have, you asked at the top of the show differences in who I am as a bettor now versus when I was on last year. And like I would have last year, I probably had 5 season win total bets made. I probably had a handful of Cy Young and MVP and stuff like that. And Matt, I have one of those. I took Texas over, tailing my buddy Gil on that. And that's it. That's the only season long bet that I have right now. And I'm like, it doesn't bother me whatsoever. There's no FOMO. There's no, like, oh, I missed something. No, I'm perfectly happy with that. And that's where I am. Basketball, I'm sweating a Joel Embiid MVP ticket that I got close to the beginning of the year, 6-1. I cannot believe that this might cash. I cannot believe that. Like, it was so, like, it got to the point, Matt, where I almost was gonna, like, to free up some credit, I was gonna hit up my guy and be like, can I just pay this out now? Like, I was that sure that it was a dead bet. I'm exaggerating a little bit there, but I was certain that was dead in the water, and I cannot believe that Joel Embiid might get home. I'm betting a couple other, or I'm sweating a couple other. Like, I took OKC Thunder like 500-1 to win the whole thing, and just to to have something every night with NBA to have like a just to check the scores and to give myself some sort of rooting interest. What are the other sports you mentioned? You mentioned baseball, covered that. Basketball, covered that. Hockey, I do not. Hockey is the one sport, Matt, that I maybe have one bet the entire calendar year in. And it's not for any underappreciation for the sport. It's just in the circle that is my sports betting. Hockey is just the one that I cannot cram in there.
Fair enough. I think you've given us plenty of insight, not only across soccer, but everything else that you've been either betting recently or at least sweating out some bets that you made a while ago. And not only are you making bets yourself, but of course, a prolific content creator when it comes to the better life.
That's
and
right.
Tim, I know that things have got to be a bit different now with much bigger priorities as a parent for these past 5 months. So with that in mind, how has that dynamic shaken things up and affected your plans for the show moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, for people who listen, they know that I thought episode 200, which was going to come out in the fall, was going to be my last episode, right? I had decided that I was just going to hang up my microphone then. I've been podcasting for 10 years on a handful of different topics, right? I've had podcasts on veteran suicide. I've had podcasts on I've had other sports podcasts. I've had comedy podcasts. I've had, I've covered the gamut of topics, both professionally and personally. But the better life, man, it just feels different. I remember when I told my wife I wanted to pursue this, she's like, this will probably be your most successful podcast. She's like, this is it. And what's crazy is my wife's not a gambler, right? She just doesn't, this is not a part activity or an industry she gives one flying F about, right? And it was amazing that she just sort of, and when I told her the idea, what I wanted to do, she's like, this will be it. This will probably be your most successful podcast. And she was right. 200 episodes eclipsed my other, before this, 100 was the farthest I'd gotten with a podcast. And so 200 seemed like a dream. I was ready to hang it up. And then I got so distracted with preparing for the baby and getting everything, like we had house projects to finish and stuff like that, to where I didn't even make it to, I think, 195 by the time the baby was born. And I was like, well, I still got to make it to episode 200, right? I'm not going to give up on that. And by the time I got to episode 200, like, I'm putting out an episode every like 3 to 5 weeks, right? Like it's not a lot while I'm learning how to be a dad. And episode 200 came around and I was like, I can do this. I can fit this in. And I'm so thankful that I have a wife and in-laws that are willing to watch the baby while I sit here and report podcasts with my sports betting friends and my casino friends, right? And they know that this is good for me, that, this is good for my mental health and to continue to pursue something I enjoy. I do the same thing for my wife. I watch the kid while she, pursues her hobbies and interests, and we have that balance. And so here I am. I just dropped episode 205 yesterday with Will Hill, at Not the Will Hill on for people who know. And yeah, look, I've told my listeners is finding casino players is difficult. Finding casino players that are good at talking about playing in the casino is difficult. Sports bettors are, they're a dime a dozen these days. But the show continues on. I hold myself to releasing an episode once every other week, and I'm proud to say that I think I've released an episode every week since I may have missed 1 or 2 weeks since the year started. So I'm excited to be here, man. I'm so thankful to be still sitting in this podcast and sports betting, gambling community where I've met so many amazing people. I hope to see all of you, including you, Matt, at Bet Bash in August. It looks like that's going to work out for me as well. So awesome. I don't even know if this is even answering your question about where the better life is, but I just felt like that's where I wanted to go with it. Truly grateful that I still get to do this stuff, because this is truly sports betting, gambling in general is such a unique hobby. It doesn't seem like it anymore because sports betting is legal. We see it everywhere. We feel like everybody's betting. It's still a very unique experience to be a bettor, right? You're still, in a family gathering that's watching the game. I bet most people listening to this you or maybe one other family member have action on it. You're just viewing that game in a different lens than everybody else, but it's such a unique experience to be a gambler. So excited to still be here and creating content.
And I can say I'm confidently not just speaking for myself and expressing some gratitude for that second wind that you've caught with The Better Life. So it's been great to see those episodes repopulating my podcast feed and kind of bringing together everything we've talked about thus far from a betting standpoint, from a content standpoint. I'd like to weave in the Malinsky Minute here as a nod to the late, great David Malinsky, who this month passed away suddenly 5 years ago. And might be putting you on the spot a bit here, but it's a question I'm confident you'll have a good answer to. I was fortunate to know Dave, not just as a friend, but really as a mentor for the last couple years of his life. And to that end, Tim, throughout all your experience in this community, what would you say is the best advice that you've received?
So I thought about this for a while, and it's difficult to sort of give anything the credit of best, most, trying to come up with a. But the advice that kept coming to mind as I was thinking about this was one. I was stationed in Algiers, Algeria, as a Marine security guard, guarding the embassy with all of my might. And one of the embassy employees who I became good friends with, we were taught. I was still young. I knew nothing about investments. I knew nothing about money. I was still learning all of that stuff. And I remember him telling me, Tim, pigs get fed and hogs get slaughtered. And I've applied that to betting and gambling. I waited too long to apply that in casino gaming, I'll admit that. But I've applied that largely in how I handle money and definitely in gambling. And it has saved me a lot of times when I think about, it's really easy to get on, like, win a bunch of bets in a day and then just like fire on nonsense the next day, right? Because you have some more money in the account, you're having a good time, whatever it may be. But reminding yourself that, like, greed, is going to bite you in the butt on this stuff. And, the whole, going back to talking about how I've evolved, how I'm focusing on certain markets, stuff like that, that all falls in line with that advice of I'm not here to just hog all, like trying to get my money in every market that someone, I'm not listening to every show, betting everything that I hear. I'm not trying to overload myself. I'm here to get fed, focusing on the leagues that I'm good at, and not trying to overdo myself otherwise. And it's especially true in the casino as well, right? I'm up, it's time to go, take a break. I don't want to get carried away here.
Well said. I would like to bring this conversation full circle now, swinging back to the hops as I make quite a dent in my can of Images of Rapture. Gotta say, this German style dark lager, nice and roasty for a 5.1% ABV beer. A lot of times, if I get anything roasty or more malt forward like this, it might be a stout or porter, and especially some stouts can be well into the double-digit ABV range. So it's nice to get that flavor profile once in a while, but stay in the very sessionable, 5.1% ABV range. So it's been great to enjoy this over the course of a really thoughtful conversation with you, Tim. And I know that you introduced the beer that you have on hand for this episode off the top, but perhaps a different beer steering into a different lane. How would you describe your go-to beer these days, if there's any one specific beer or a certain style that you've been gravitating toward lately?
Yeah, look, time is it's an asset. It's a resource that anybody that we all are limited on, right? And then when you become a parent, even more so. And so, I don't. I often have to run my errands at a time of night where the beer shops aren't open, like where I want to go pick up my beer. So a lot of times when I want a beer, I have to grab something from the grocery store. And as unsexy as that is, fortunately in the year 2023, craft beer has had multiple years of booming and growing, and local beer can get into your grocery store more easily now. And so, I get really Three Notch. This was a beer that I never thought I'd see in the grocery store. It's 5 hours away, and sure enough, it popped up, and I was excited because I like their beer. I've had their beer multiple times, otherwise, and I was like, oh snap! And I thought I knew we were going to talk about sort of where I am on beer. That's why I chose this one, because it's where I'm at. I don't, I see the Lagunitas and stuff like that. I mean, I was like, come on, like I don't want to drink something that just came all the way from the West Coast. Like it doesn't feel like it doesn't feel fresh. You know what I mean? Like, I want it doesn't taste the same, man. I had Lagunitas when I lived in California, and I can tell you right now, 10 years ago, having a Lagunitas IPA was way different than having a bottle of it on the East Coast now. But I think Lagunitas has an East Coast brew shop, now that I think about it. Anyways, none of that matters. MGM National Harbor has a beer called Let It Ride, RYE''D, Let It Ride, and it is a rye IPA. It is delicious. It's the only place you can get it. It's exclusive to their tap sports bar there. I'm gonna say it again. It is delicious. If you like IPAs and if you've ever had a rye IPA and you like it, you're gonna love this. I don't think he'll mind me saying. Zach White met me there one day for a drink, and he agreed that it was delicious. Like we both had it, and he agreed it was also delicious. So you don't. Not just to think about it, like other people have agreed that it's a very good beer. It's just like 6%, I want to say too. So like it doesn't like smack you in the face or leave you like stumbling out of the sports, the sports bar. So that's a go-to when I'm not just picking up a can of beer from the grocery store. Like if I'm at MGM National Harbor and have like an hour to spare, I'll go pick up a pint of that and enjoy that.
Love it. And Zach White was a guest on this show. Man, my mind's getting a bit fuzzy now. A little bit less than a year ago, I believe, after Bet Bash 2, we met there, and he was the perfect guest for Props and Hops, considering his expertise as a pro bettor, as a brewery owner. I just feel like there's no better combination than that. So I love that you were able to share this beer with him, and also the fact that Zach has talked about the value of really specializing in small markets, and that's the best way to get an edge for an up-and-coming bettor. So I think that dovetails so nicely with what a lot of you've brought to the table from a soccer betting standpoint over the course of this conversation.
That's true. That's right. Zach's a good guy. It's been great to get to know him over the past year or two. By the way, if anybody's curious, this game that I've been sweating just got tied up in the 64th minute, so the sweat is on.
All right, I will have to let you get back to it. Do want to, while we mentioned Zach as a brewery owner too, shout out to Salty Turtle in
Yes,
Surf City. I believe. Let me make sure I'm getting this right.
that's
Is it
right.
North Carolina,
North
South
Carolina.
Carolina,
North
North
Carolina,
Carolina?
just south of Wilmington. Yeah.
Okay, there we go. Surf City, North Carolina. Salty Turtle. Go say hey to Zach and his team. To anybody who's in that area. Tim, I look forward to many good beers at Bet Bash 3. I'm glad that seems like it is lining up nicely on your end. I've already got my tickets, so I will look forward to seeing you there. And to the audience, if you want to catch more of what Tim's up to, you can follow him on Twitter at The Better Life. That's better with an O as the second to last letter. Also, The Better Life podcast. Tim, anything else I'm missing or anything you'd like to add?
Nope. I have a Twitter handle at soccer is better, BETTOR, that I don't like putting a lot of soccer stuff in my main feed just because my audience gets kind of annoyed by it. So I've done, soccer is better is where I put a lot of my soccer heavy stuff, but everything else Better Life goes on that Twitter feed that you just mentioned.
All right. Well, Tim, once again, thank you for the time and insight. Really enjoyed the thoughtful conversation here. And to the audience, thank you for tuning in. Next 3 episodes, so that you know all in on the NFL draft as that market hopefully develops a bit further for us as draft day approaches. And with the Carolina Panthers on the clock, I'll catch you next week right back here on Props and Hops.
Cheers.